Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. I have another top 10 list for you today, the top 10 rules from Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. 8th edition is a rule set that I find gets a lot of hate, and people really like to criticize it as kind of ruining the old 6th and 7th edition rule set. Personally, I think that this criticism is a little unfair. In fact, I think Warhammer 8th edition has a few rules that really enhance the game based on some of the previous editions. Now, granted, I am coming from the perspective of a player that primarily plays Warhammer in more of a casual setting. So amongst my Warhammer group, amongst family and friends, things of this nature. Although I did participate in the occasional tournament. So I might better understand some of the criticism from a person who's coming from it from the perspective of that uber competitive environment where you really want ideally a game that is out of the box completely balanced. So 8th edition is not out of the box completely balanced by any sense, and I get that. And to a certain extent, you're relying on the culture of your gaming group to kind of have an understanding of what is reasonable in terms of what you're bringing to the table and how you play the game. Now, with that said, everything else that I'm going to say here is going to be positive because I think as a rule set, 8th edition is one of my favorite editions of Warhammer. Although for me, Warhammer is kind of like pizza. Some pizza is better than others, but rarely have I encountered pizza that I just went, I hate this pizza. So with that said, let's get to the list. I have an honorable mention for the list, which is linking Irresistible Force and Miscast. I think that this was an ingenious idea. Irresistible Force is really powerful. It allows you to force a spell through, and your opponent can't do anything to stop it, so it's just going to happen. When you couple that with the fact that there are really some game-changing or potentially even game-winning spells, this is all upside for your opponent if they get the double six. So in some of the past editions, double six might be Irresistible Force, whereas the miscast would occur on double ones. So throwing a lot of dice is still a risk in that case, but it's either all good or all bad. I really thought it was an elegant change linking the good component of Irresistible Force to the negative component of miscast, because miscast can be really devastating. I mean, your wizard can just outright get killed. Huge swatches of your troops can get killed. Potentially to miscast, your wizard can lose spells, etc. So I really thought it was a clever way of, I won't say balancing magic, but just a clever dynamic. It was just like, okay, well, you got to take the good with the bad. Getting over to the official list, in the 10th spot, we have Regeneration or Ward Save, but not both. I think this was a really nice change for 8th edition. When you have all three types of saves available to a character, Armor Save, Ward Save, Regeneration Save, and the character is able to access all three, it just felt like a lot in terms of trying to get some wounds through, and Ward saves are powerful enough without also allowing the regeneration save. I thought it was a really nice change for 8th edition. In the 9th spot, we have the Vanguard rule. I really think this added an interesting element to the beginning of the game. Right, so a unit that has Vanguard is able to make a 12-inch move prior to rolling to see who goes first. I think that's an interesting element that they added for 8th edition. You don't know for a fact that you're going to get the first turn. Now, getting the +1, right? So if you finish deploying first, you get a +1 to that roll. That sways the odds in your favor pretty heavily. So you can go on that, but it's definitely no guarantee. And being able to make that 12-inch move. Now, if you make that move, you can't charge if you go first on the first turn. Okay, so that's good. But it is an interesting dynamic here at play between the Vanguard, especially if you have opposing armies at Vanguard, because you can't move any closer than 12 inches with this move. So potentially you have this strategy that's going on where you're Vanguarding to try to block your opponent's Vanguard, and it gives you the opportunity to line something up before the game even starts. In the 8th spot, we have the Steadfast rule. This is a really interesting rule in my opinion. So if your unit loses combat but has more complete ranks than the opposing unit, then the unit gets to test on its unmodified leadership, so as though it was stubborn, essentially. Now, this really adds a lot of credence in my mind to some of your bigger horde units, like big blocks of goblins, Skaven slaves, zombies, Noblars, makes them more useful than they would be otherwise, that if they didn't have this. So you can kind of bank on those units hanging around, despite the fact that they're going to get beat up in combat. So I think it was a really nice addition. The make way rule is coming in at the number 7 spot here. I think that this is a great rule in 8th edition Warhammer. And in some of the previous editions, if your character wasn't in the combat, right, wasn't in base contact with an enemy model, then he didn't get an opportunity to attack. Now, it was set up in a way where during your next movement phase, you could move him, but you couldn't do it immediately for that particular combat. And that, in retrospect, didn't make a lot of sense, right? Make way makes a lot more sense to me, that your leaders would be leaning towards the fray, like your combat heroes would want to get in the fray and would be able to move about the unit in an actual combat scenario and wouldn't just be sidelined, especially in a critical combat where if they don't get in that first round, if the unit breaks, they might not get in at all. So a make way allows for an immediate solution if your character is not in combat and you want him to be. Coming in at the 6th spot, we have fire in 2 ranks. It never really made a ton of sense to me that units of archers and other missile-based units only fired in 1 rank. It seems likely that, historically speaking, I think archers and other such troops would have had the ability to fire in 2 ranks. Even if the front rank might be taking a knee or you're firing over the shoulder of the person in front of you, it seems more logical to me in that sense. So I think this was a great addition. And, if you have a unit of 10 archers, in order for them in previous editions to all be firing, you have to go 10 wide, which is just massively wide. So having that unit be as effective as it can be, but only going 5 wide is a really, really great 8th edition new rule. In the 5 spot, we have Stomp and Thunderstomp. I'm combining these two. I think they're similar enough in terms of how they impact the game. But effectively, monstrous infantry, monstrous cavalry, and monsters are getting some kind of bonus stomp attack, where monsters are getting Thunderstomp. So your monstrous infantry and cavalry are going to be making an additional attack at their base strength at the end of the combat, so last. And monsters are going to do the same thing, except they're going to roll a d6, and this is going to be the number of hits. So monsters are really swingy. And I think this adds a lot of excitement to the combat because the Thunderstomp roll is actually kind of a pretty critical roll oftentimes. There's just such a massive difference to the combat resolution rolling a 1 versus rolling a 6, because oftentimes monsters aren't necessarily having that much of a hard time wounding on these types of hits from the Thunderstomp. Wounding on 3s, sometimes wounding on 2s. So you can see a big swing in this, and I think it adds an excitement into a flair to the particular combat. It also makes monsters and monstrous infantry more effective versus your bigger infantry units, which you might see at times in 8th edition. In the 4th spot, we have supporting attacks. 8th edition really allows for units to bring a ton of attacks to bear, and supporting attacks are part of this. So a model is just making 1 attack from second ranks. And if you're monstrous infantry, for example, you're going to be making up to 3 attacks for supporting attacks. So one of the things I really like about 8th edition is you get to roll just a ton of dice, right? You're making more attacks than you were in other editions. This is due in part to things like the Horde rule and Steadfast, which is encouraging you to bring larger size units. But also the supporting attacks really add another element that I think is cool. I like lots of attacks. I like lots of carnage. I like lots of bloodshed on the battlefield, and 8th edition really provides for that. In the 3 spot, we have the step up rule. So essentially, as models are killed, then the model behind them is said to quote unquote step up, which means so long as their initiative number hasn't already passed, you're not going to lose those attacks. And this is kind of a transformation from some of the previous editions. In some of the previous editions, if your opponent charged, they're going to go first. And if they kill a bunch of models, or if they kill all the models in the front rank, you don't get to attack at all. I have to be honest, that never made a ton of sense to me, and it definitely created situations where there's a lot of frustration, right? And somebody's always going to go first, right? Somebody's always going to get the charge. And I do understand the argument of, look, that's part of the strategy of the game, is maneuvering and lining up these charges and preventing your opponents from doing them, and that kind of getting the upper hand in that maneuver phase, that strategy phase. But it didn't make sense to me that one side just wouldn't attack, right? Even if they're getting attacked a little faster than their opponents, that they would have some kind of strike back, even if that's from the second rank models. So the step up rule, I think, is makes a lot of sense to me. It seems more logical to me, and I think it creates just a more enjoyable gaming experience where you're not going to go around a combat and not get to attack just because your front rank got killed. I think it's a really improving addition to the rules. All right, so I think with the number 2 and number 1 spot, I might start to get people's ire here. But in the number 2 spot, we have random charge distances. I actually think random charge distances greatly improved Warhammer, and I love it as an 8th edition rule. So I think the criticism for this might be that it removes elements of strategy that maybe existed in some of the other editions. And I'll maybe agree with that with a bit of an asterisk. I think it changes the strategy. I think there's still a lot of strategy regarding charging, even though there's a component that is random. You're rolling the dice to determine the exact charge distance. However, the strategy, I think, comes in quite a bit as to what you're going to offer your opponent, what risks you're going to take, understanding the probability of making a successful charge, knowing when to push it, knowing the benefits, right? Weighing the benefits of making a charge versus the risk. If I need an 8 on 2 dice, statistically, I'm not going to get it, right? I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it's probably like a 45% chance of getting it. So I'm going to weigh that, though, versus what I gain if I get it. And I think that that is a huge element of strategy. And I also think there's a huge element of strategy within this system of offering your opponent something as a bait. Like, hey, are you willing to take this risk to charge this unit? And, maybe you're double charging, or maybe it's a flank charge or something, but it's a longer charge. So I think the strategy is in knowing the probabilities, in offering it, and knowing the right time to take a risk. And the other reason that I really like the random charge distance with the dice rolls is this. It adds an element of excitement to the game, right? There's been instances where I needed boxcars to make a charge, and just the situation I felt dictated that it was time to go for it. And it's exciting to hit those boxcars, right? Your opponent offers you something crazy and you just kind of shrug your shoulders, you go for it and you hit it. That makes for a way better story than, I estimated 8 inches out precisely and I knew it was 8 inches and I got it. So I think random charge distance are really cool. Also, it levels out the playing field in terms of charges a bit. I've played dwarves from time to time. I've played dwarves in previous editions from 8th edition. It's a difficult army to play, right? I mean, you could do a gun line, then you're not worried about moving, but that's not fun. I didn't find it that fun to play, and I think people necessarily didn't find it that fun to play against. But if you try to do a block of dwarf army that's going to try to charge and maneuver a little bit, you're never going to get a charge off, right? You're only going 6 inches, whereas even your other average infantry is going to go 8 inches. But if you compare those same 2 units in 8th edition, your average dwarf charge is 10 inches versus your average orc or human charge is 11 inches. It's all of a sudden very, very close. And dwarves now have a real chance of getting the charge off. I like that better. I really do. I think the variance is great. And I don't think it's void of strategy. I think the strategy is just different. And finally, the number 1 spot, number 1, pre-measuring. This was a big change, a really big change. And I found it a little jarring at first because my whole Warhammer experience was you had to estimate measurement, and your success or failure in the game would largely be based at times on how closely you could visually recognize the distance from point A to point B on a tabletop. So the reason why I love pre-measuring is not because I don't think that estimating distance is a useful skill or it's a strategy. It clearly is. But having done this now for the 10 plus years I've been playing 8th edition, I think it really streamlines the game. And for those who maybe feel like this takes out an element of strategy, I think I would beg to differ a little bit, because I have yet to meet an experienced wargamer, an experienced Warhammer player in previous editions that was unable to accurately determine the number of inches from point A to point B, especially when you're talking 8 to 12 inch range, within a quarter of an inch, just with consistency. Now, it takes time. And it slows the game down, in my opinion, having played it now with pre-measuring being okay. So I think pre-measuring, it streamlines the game. You're not sitting there, and when you're looking at a cannon, when I played Dwarves in previous editions, I literally would practice, right? I would put the salt shaker here and the pepper shaker over here on the table, and I would just eyeball it, and I would practice looking at the distance and estimating it, and then I would measure it to see how close I got. And then I would repeat it by moving them and altering them, changing the angle. And you get really good at it. You get really good at it really fast. And I don't think it is actually a necessary step in the game. So pre-measuring, just let it flow. You have the random charge distances, so knowing the charge range exactly is not something that you need. And I think it actually goes hand in hand very well with the random charge distances. And it also, I think, helps bring new players into the game, especially young players. So I think the caveat to that is while experienced wargamers, I don't think really struggle with it very much in my experience. I think children struggle with it greatly. Now, obviously, if you're playing with a child, you can just let them pre-measure in previous editions. I think that's probably the right move. But I think pre-measurement and just allowing it all the time was actually a brilliant move by the rule writers for Warhammer 8th edition. It is my favorite change in the edition, and I love it. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with someone who you think would also enjoy it. If you are really upset by the video because you hate 8th edition, feel free to tell me why I'm totally wrong about any of these rules. Or 8th edition in general, but I do love it as an edition. Feel free to share in the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. Bye for now.